Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Abu GW-1 Wash Process Panama from Glitch Coffee Roasters. There's the cup right there. And Glitch, based out of Tokyo, Japan. And I'm currently at a park nearby their Chiyoda City location, which it appears to be their original location. And funny enough, this is one of the coffee shops I do know that I visited a couple of years ago. Last time I was in Japan, as immediately upon entering the shop itself, I recognized everything inside the store, including the older probats that they do roast on. So that was pretty fun. The notes about this coffee roaster, it's kind of interesting just how many coffees they have. As of this point, they have the biggest selection out of any of the coffee roasters, coffee shops I have visited, including an abundance of high-end coffees. So the main reason I went for this one is obviously because Panamanian geishas are my favorite coffee in the entire world. And when speaking with the baristas, they seemed to focus a little bit more on the heavily processed coffees. In fact, all of their suggestions were on the more heavily processed ones. So I opted for this one right here. In addition to that, I actually have never reviewed one of Abu's geishas, so I feel like that in itself should make for an interesting review. And one other note on that, I actually met Abu at the coffee conference just a couple of days ago, so that's kind of cool, and this is a nice chance to discuss their coffee. And as I kind of alluded to, they had an abundance of coffees that were available to try, and those were all hand brewed. Now, the other thing we must discuss on this one is the development of this coffee, because I'd heard so many positive things about this coffee roaster from so many people. In fact, when people found out that I was visiting Tokyo, this was the most highly requested and suggested coffee roaster for me to visit, which is why it's kind of surprising that as of this moment from the shops I have tried, this is the most developed of those coffees, as this one right here I would say is actually even a little smokier than the one we had from the Geshery. So let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee, and as always, I do have my notes right here. And the things I noticed, and the very first thing I noticed was that it was a little heavier at the start, and there was a fair bit of smokiness within the cup. And that's going to be demonstrated quite prominently in the tasting wheel itself. But I took note of that when I was looking and taking in the aroma of the coffee beans themselves, because I saw that the coloring on it was just this shade darker than I've seen from any of the other coffee roasters. So I kind of had an idea that that's what I might have expected. And I think maybe part of the reason I didn't remember visiting it the first time around was because I just don't think I actually remembered the coffee that well. I don't think that there was anything on that first trip that ever stood out to me about their coffee. But I definitely wanted to give one of their higher end coffees a shot. And this one right here, it came out to 3,500 yen, which I believe roughly translates to a little over $21. It's a pretty expensive cup of coffee. So the expectations for it, for a number of reasons, were both high in the sense that it is a very nice coffee and it is one of my favorite types of coffee. But then the other side being that I kind of expected it to come out this way when trying it. And that's the experience I had from actually trying the coffee itself. Other notable things were a very strong lingering citric component that I am still experiencing right now. It does have a very long-lasting finish in that regard. So those are some qualities noticed right at the forefront. In addition to that, there is a more, we'll say, sugary stone fruit aspect. So again, I'm thinking a little bit more in line with something like an apricot, though they do have a peach note list on here, a white peach, which also makes sense. White peaches in general tend to be a little bit more sugary of these stone fruits. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And of course, I have my notes pulled up right here, so let's go ahead and take a look. And we actually do have two level 5s. So let's start with the finish, level 5. And that is one of the first things I mentioned when discussing this coffee is I was just kind of surprised by how much of a long-lasting finish there was. And that finish came in multiple aspects. So there was that slightly smoky quality that was complementing a very strong citric component. So the citrus in this one is very pronounced, very strong, and that's also demonstrated in this tasting wheel as you see it right there at that level 5. Taking a look at what notes they do have actually on here, lemon tea and yuzu. So that does make a lot of sense as there's so many of those citric and just more heavier citric components within this one. So in addition to that, of course, the sugary stone fruit that I had kind of mentioned, that also is notable in the finish too. So there's just some very vibrant and strong flavors all around within this cup, which does tend to skew this coffee tasting well in those directions. And we have a bunch of level 4s, so we'll start with the sweetness level 4. Yes, that's one of the nicer things I do have to say about this coffee is it is offering a higher level of sweetness within the coffee itself, and it is skewing a little bit more in terms of the fruit direction, as well as some nice floral sweet components to it as well. So there are some really nice qualities to it, as you can also see that scoring pretty high in the florality with that level 4 mark. And when I was trying this coffee right at the forefront, right off the brew itself, there was plenty of the jasmine-like components. Another thing that they did have listed on here, so plenty of just floral experiences within this one. And then the stone fruit level 4, once again, they do have white peach, and honestly, I don't mind if those are used somewhat interchangeably, white peach, apricot. Regardless of what it is a little bit more of a sugary stone fruit as opposed to that more fresh fruit, sort of stone fruit aspect to it. So I do see that there. We have a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. I think that's one of the more surprising parts of this coffee, as I was expecting and hoping for maybe a little bit more brightness and vibrancy in that regard, but it's a little bit more even, a little bit more mild in that sense. And I think the actual card that they give you with this coffee is kind of interesting. I'll show you guys what it looks like. So they score things really, really high, and I just kind of imagine that it's all on a relative scale as my own tasting wheel is, but the acidity itself, it's scoring very, very high on their chart, but it's that same measure almost everything is scoring really high. The things they have the highest are the aroma and the flavor, which I can agree with. Those are very strong, but the aftertaste for me is something that would score just as high as those couple of things. And then we have the caramel level 3. I do think that might be slightly attributed to both the roast profile of this one as well as the fact that they use a probat on it, as it does have a nice caramelized sweetness to it, which is giving the rest of this cup just a little bit more sweetness in general, and part of the reason why I think it scored as high as it did. And then we have two really big things that are worth discussing, the first of which being the smokiness in this one. And again, it's tricky because every coffee I've had up to this point, with the exception of the Geshri, has been lighter than my previous experiences with Japanese coffee roasters. But I think that does kind of go to show what my first experience coming to Japan was like 3.5 years ago, because that time I was experiencing a lot of these similar traits within all of the coffees that I had tried, and I just kept feeling that they were all a little bit more smoky and developed than I typically tend to like, and that's partially the reason why I might have forgotten having been to this coffee shop before actually entering this coffee shop. But yeah, the smokiness, scoring that level 3, that was really surprising for me on this. And then the biggest and most important thing we must discuss is the cleanliness level 3. Yes, and this is a Panamanian geisha, which is always going to be a little disappointing when it doesn't score a level 5. But I think that this one was really hindered by the strong smoky qualities that were present within this one. Because even if I wanted to score to level 4, I feel like it's just kind of taking away from the definition of the other profiles in it. I mean, the citrus is very defined, very pronounced, but then the stone fruits as well as the florals, they're not necessarily an overly clean or defined component within this coffee. I think that the smokiness just really is playing a huge role in that, and the fact that this coffee might have a little bit more just fermentiness than I typically would expect, especially for a Panamanian geisha. You could say that maybe this tasting wheel is relative to experiences from Panamanian geishas as a whole, but I honestly felt like 3 was the best place to score the clarity, and as I'm kind of looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like it's safe to say that I had some pretty high expectations, some high standards for this one anyway, given exactly what this coffee is. No secret, love washed Panamanian geishas, and having it not score the level 4 in terms of the clarity at a minimum is obviously going to be a huge sticking point for me. In addition to that, I'm obviously not necessarily the biggest fan of citrus. When citrus is in Panamanian geishas, I do hope it's well complemented by other things, florals most specifically, and maybe some other fruity notes, but most specifically, it needs to have that very high clarity to it, which this one didn't necessarily have. So if I'm being completely honest, this is probably the coffee I've enjoyed the least as of this moment, and it could be a number of factors, including the expectations I had for it going into it, but just overall, not necessarily my profile sort of coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, is somebody that might like a little bit more development to their coffee in general, because as I've kind of mentioned, it also felt like the most developed coffee I've had as of this moment. There's a fair bit of those smoky qualities that I keep going back to within it, and that's something that really needs to be taken note of. In addition to that, the citric qualities, that's the most strong and defining pronounced flavor profile within this one. So if you do like your really strong citrus, then that's going to be there. It's a little bit more, I would still say heavy. It's not like an overly tart or strong citrus in that sense, but just a little bit more kind of tricky and just vibrant citrus in general. In addition to that, some really nice floral components. Don't want to downplay the niceness of it. Kind of that jasmine that they have listed on here, very nice. The stone fruit's also pronounced, and it does have a nice little caramelized candied sweetness to it. For the most part, I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything else from Glitch, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Abu GW-1 wash processed Panama from Glitch Coffee. Thank you for watching.